For those with awakened hearts, take the time to learn and understand the truth. Israel refers to the 12 tribes of Israel, the seed of Abraham through Jacob's 12 sons. This seed is scattered through the earth. It comprises all those who have accepted the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Israel, the place, today comprises mainly the tribe of Judah. Judah, the tribe, has been taken over by a cult of Zionists. Zionists hate Muslims and Jews. Zionists practice a system of apartheid. Most people in the world probably do not realize, but Jews and Palestinians were like brothers before Zionism, which is a secret society, took control. It is known as Rothschild Zionism. Zionism is apostate Jews. The word apostate means those who have turned against God. These apostate Jews who practice Luciferianism, demonology and hidden knowledge. The New World Order is a Zionist government that will eventually be ruled by the Antichrist. The Zionists will implement the Noahide laws. These laws will enforce the decapitation of Christians because they consider the worship of Jesus Christ blasphemy, punishable by death. They will kill Christians for the same reason they crucified Jesus Christ. Jesus will save the tribe of Judah at Armageddon, but not Zionist Jews who do not worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Please watch all the video and understand some of the truth. This powerful documentary exposes the hell that the Palestinians have been going through since their land was stolen in 1948. From that day on, the world has been hijacked by a cabal of Zionists, occultists, and the support given to them by government has alienated much of the world. Israhell on Earth looks at the origins of the abomination that is Israel and exposes its apartheid crimes. This documentary is informative. It gives all the facts. It has video to back up everything it says. It is the truth, and everybody who is interested in what is happening in that part of the world and in our world needs to watch this video so that they can know the truth.
The fact of the matter is that each day when you open the newspapers, Israel is gearing up for a war against another country, another innocent, often defenseless people. This past week they talked about a second attack, or Operation Cast Lead 2, against Gaza. Then they talk about attacking Lebanon. Then they talk about attacking Iran. I think it is correct to say that in the modern world, in the contemporary world, there is really no state quite like Israel. Israel is off the cliff. It's become a lunatic state.
America and Israel share an unbreakable bond.
AIPAC is one of the reasons why.
All of us share a fundamental belief that the freedom and security of Israel are vital interests of the United States of America.
We need you now more than ever.
Between 2000 until 2009, around 6,700 children were detained. That's not a mistake. That's not something that's confusing to the Israeli military. Children are being abused throughout the
being targeted?
They are being targeted.
What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous. In their own territory, by the occupying powers, which is Israel. They've taken away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians. But there's no doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid.
כל רמאללה זה ג'ונגל, יש שם קופים, כלבים, גורילות. הבעיה שהחיות עכשיו סגורות שם, הם לא יוצאים. מה? לא, אנחנו בני אדם, הם חיות. להם אין צלם אנוש, לנו יש. זה ההבדל בין... מה? תצלם, אכפת לי, אני חושבת, למישהו נראה לך. זה גם הרמטכ"ל יראה.
A three-day Russell Tribunal in Cape Town, South Africa, brought together key political and legal minds to determine that Israel is operating under an apartheid system. But people want more than this groundbreaking result. They want change.
We are demanding Israel to stop this racist system and to change it and to admit and recognize equal national and civic rights for the Palestinians, because it is our homeland, because we didn't immigrate to Israel, because it was Israel who immigrated to us, because we didn't immigrate to Israel, because it was Israel who immigrated to us.
If someone came inside your home, you came home and you found someone in your home, and you asked them why you're here, you said, because in the scripture that God gave to me, he said that this house here belonged to me. You would say, no, get out of my house. So they kill your father, they kill your brother, they kill your uncle, they kill everybody except the children. And they stay in that house. And those children they did not kill, even though they cannot get back in the house again. Every time those children passed by that house, they pick up a stone and they throw it at that house. And those people in the house, they shoot at those children. I would ask you, are those children criminals? If they came, if those children, if that's all they could do was throw a rock at those people that took your house, would those children be criminals? The person said, no, that's a very pathetic situation. I said, that is the condition of Palestine. There's nothing but children throwing stones, facing tanks. But that's all they can do. And I say that if Allah only gives to the children of Palestine rocks to throw and a heart to face tanks, they must face the tanks and they must continue to throw stones.
Boys are gathering near the border to throw stones at Israeli bulldozers.
Because that is an act of honor. And if there are no more men to throw stones, to carry the honor of those people, then the children, they must continue to throw stones until there is no one else to throw a stone.
When my great-parents, came from Russia in 150 years ago, they came because there was a Bible in one hand. My great-grandfather from Dnepropetrovsk came with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in another, and his hand was extended to the Arabs who lived here. Some did make business with him. Others who fought him had to meet the wrath of his rifle. And that's how you live in the Middle East. We are a people who want to survive. We succeeded in surviving because we were able to defend ourselves, to stand up throughout the centuries.
Go ahead,
Without
Norman.
that, we wouldn't have been there. That's why we are an endangered species.
All right, let's go to Norman here. Go ahead.
It is an oddity that you say you're coming and you want to live in peace with somebody. You come with a rifle in your hand. I often have friends visit me at my home, and when they come to my home, they don't come with a rifle.
So did the first settlers in the United
So
States of
you have to ask
America.
yourself, I appreciate Dr. Gisson's comparison because I think it's exactly right. The first Euro-Americans who came to North America came with a rifle in hand because they came with the intention of displacing and dispossessing the indigenous population. That's why they needed a rifle. And most Americans nowadays at least acknowledge the fact that what was done to the indigenous population of North America was wrong. And it's exactly for the same reason that Israel, or I should say Jews from Eastern Europe, had to come to Israel or Palestine with a rifle in hand, because their intention was not to live with the indigenous population, but to displace and dispossess it in order to create a Jewish state in an area which was overwhelmingly Arab. And I think pretty much everything that ensued after that followed from that basic fact.
I know both from the moral sense and from the practical sense that the only way to stop the violence is to treat the root cause from which the violence has started.
The number one myth that Westerners have about this conflict is that Arabs and Jews have been fighting for thousands of years and they're going to continue to fight.
This is really quite bizarre because all it takes is a little bit of reading of history to find out that this just isn't true. There is no congenital historical enmity between the Arabs and the Jews. The Jews flourished in the Arab world at a time when they were being persecuted throughout all of Europe.
At the end of the 19th century, because of anti-Semitism in Europe, European Jews began to try and figure out a solution to the Jewish problem. A very small minority adhered to Zionism, the idea that the only place in which they could be safe is within the Jewish state.
Zionist Jews actually had a design on the land of Palestine, the idea of creating a homeland for Jews in the land of Palestine. And this is really the beginning of the conflict.
The concept for Jews to have a state is expressly forbidden in the Torah, in the Jewish teaching, since the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago. We were told by the Almighty in a prophecy of King Solomon and that we are forbidden to have our own entity, our own state, our own kingdom, even in an uninhabited land. And this was held by all Jews around the world for thousands of years. And it makes it worse, compounds the sin, the crime in having the state, because this state of Israel that these nationalists made it in Palestine, made it in a land that was inhabited by the majority Muslim people, by the Palestinian people.
Villagers were expelled en masse, and massacres occurred in many places. The villages of Hula, Saliyah, and Bassa were but a few to suffer such atrocities during 1948. Once Zionist troops occupied a village that resisted them, they would round up all the men according to lists the intelligence officers would provide. On the whim of the local commander, they would either shoot them or march them away. The biggest expulsion and massacre happened in the city of Lid Ramle. 50,000 people were expelled from the city in a single day. 426 men, women, and children were killed by the Zionist forces. The general in charge of the occupation and expulsion of Lid Ramle was Yitzhak Rabin, who would later become Israel Prime Minister, serving 2 terms. In 1948, the Chicago Sunday Times reported on the Israeli tactics. Practically everything in their way died. Riddled corpses lay by the side of the roads. The New York Herald Tribune wrote, "The corpses of Arab men, women, and even children strewn about in the wake of the ruthlessly brilliant charge." The London Economist reported, "The Arab refugees were systematically stripped of all of their belongings. Then, they were sent on their trek to the frontier."
I was among the people that conquered Akko. When we were walking around, we entered the flat. There was a pair of shoes of a small child, maybe 2 years old. They didn't have time to put on the shoes, so they left the shoes and they ran away. They left everything.
We found out that there was a systematic expulsion of Palestinians, and there was, as I said, there was an ethnic cleansing operation taking place.
The most infamous campaign was the massacre at the village of Deir Yassin, where over 100 men, women, and children were systematically murdered.
هذا البيت مكان متخبين فيه أنا وولادي وأخويا موسى. مكاليت هنا معيدنا أخوي موسى مساكن نتونس بالله فيه. هذا البيت. أجوا قالوا لما كنا بالبيت كنا مش كسر ثبتنا الكنبلة وجينا صوبت أنا وبنتي الصوابت لمسح ولادي وكان بعد ما راحت المراكة الحالة كانت كسروا الباب عليهم وطلعونا بدهم يقتلوا أخوي مسدوا فيه على وجهها اللي يقتلوه. تناولت 250 ليرة من عدة وقلت يا خواجه بس مشان الله الطالب بالدسات قلت لسه قال لي كتير انت كويس هات المصاري وبارس اخوتي الحنو شو نسوي فيه اخوتي الحنو اجراك يا ويلي هي زمتك على السلام تحلي وجدت انه هو حط لك الطمس زيت ويكون اصفي موسى قدامه حط له 5 مليون تحت راسه.
The ruthlessness of the attack on Deir Yassin drove fear and panic into the Palestinian population and led to the flight of unarmed civilians from their homes all over the country.
Here's Alex in North London. Alex, go ahead, sir.
Hi George, I'm calling from North London. I've been listening to you for 3 months now.
Okay.
Never had the chance to speak to you.
Okay.
But I was just calling on. I was listening to you a couple of nights ago, and you were talking to these people, and they were saying that Israel, the Jews, did not have the right to gain Israel from the Palestinians. And I was just saying, throughout history, the Jews have been persecuted, obviously, from the Holocaust, and we were granted Israel as a result of this. And I feel that...
Granted by whom?
We were granted from Britain and other countries, granted us that.
But what right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
Well, it's due because we lost 6 million people.
No. I'm not arguing about that. I'm going to come on to that. But what right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
We had the right because we lost 6 million people and we did not have a home.
Well, yeah, I'm going to ask you for a third time. What right did Britain have to grant you somebody else's country?
Well, they didn't. Well, they were giving us the right because it was they were basically gave us because of the.
But they gave you somebody else's country. That's the point I'm making, Alex. Can you deal with it?
Yeah, but the Jews have also had to. They've dealt with this throughout history.
Well, Alex, I don't know if you came on with a script and you can't deviate from it.
The mainstream Israeli Jewish society believe, because that's the way they had been educated, that Palestine was empty, had been empty when the Jewish settlers came there.
Who paid the price when they settled there? Is it really true that Israel was a land without a people for a people without a land?
Palestine was not empty. It was a land populated by Arabs who had a high level of culture, a high level of education.
With farms and markets and towns and villages and roads and commerce and lots of interaction with the rest of the world.
The population was overwhelmingly Arab.
So, what's happened is that Christian anti-Semitism in Europe, which massacred 6 million Jews in the greatest crime in human history, was paid for not by the Christian countries of Europe that either practiced or turned a blind eye to that anti-Semitism, but was paid by the very people who were completely innocent of that Holocaust, who had never persecuted the Jews, who had never pogromed the Jews. And that seems to me to add insult to the injury suffered by a people whose country was wiped off the map, who were dispersed into exile, to make way for a Zionist idea which was granted to European Jews, because these were the first settlers, granted to European Jews by Britain.
When Britain implemented the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This measure conflicted with Britain's previous promise of self-rule for Arab inhabitants throughout the region.
Britain was basically extremely supportive of the Zionist movement. It helped to establish all of the structures of a state. At the same time, the Arabs of Palestine were denied the right of self-determination.
The Palestinians saw a European power decide the future of a non-European territory, in flat disregard of both their presence and wishes. In the 1920s, as land was being stripped away from local residents, the first clashes between Palestinians and Jews began, and would continue on for years to come. In 1947, with the conflict spiraling out of control, Britain decided to turn the problem of Palestine over to the United Nations. The UN, under pressure, proposed to divide the land into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. Arabs were to be given 43% of the land, despite the fact that they made up more than 2/3 of the population and owned over 92% of the land. Jews were to be given 56%, although they comprised only 1/3 of the population and owned less than 8% of the total area.
Nevertheless, they were given not only most of the land, they were given the most fertile land.
To a group of atheistic Zionist Jews, I make the point about atheism because it's now claimed that this is some biblical land right, as if God was an estate agent.
Israel came with the intention to live alongside the Palestinians. And let me say, the way, when my great-grandfather came from Russia, you know what he said? He had it very right. And he had the Bible as his guide. He said, the rights of the land are ours because this is our land. This is why I came back, because this is our ancestral homeland.
Yes, I wonder, Dr. Gissin, if I came with a Bible in hand to your home, I knocked on your door, and I said, according to my Bible, my family lived where your home is. My family lived there 2,000 years ago. Would you pack up your bags and leave?
So you could say they didn't have a right, but they came in and dealt with us and with the Jews having lost all these lives, and they basically granted us this land. Okay.
Well, I see I'm getting nowhere on this, Alex, so let me deal with your overarching point. Maybe you're just not equipped to deal with the principal point that I have made. The Jews have suffered racist anti-Semitism down the ages in many, many European countries, including our own. They were subject to regular discrimination at best, and pogrom and murder at most. That's undoubtedly true. The one place in the entire world that Jews were neither discriminated against nor subject to pogrom was the Muslim world. In fact, so much was that the case, that when Christianity came back to power in Spain, in Andalusia, in the western extent of the Islamic Empire, when the Muslims left, the Jews left with them, because they feared the Christian anti-Semitism which would be unleashed in the wake of the departure of the Islamic civilization in the West. That's why so many Jews are to be found even today, and were to be found in profusion before the creation of the State of Israel, in countries like Morocco and along the North African coast, because under the protection of the Muslims, the Jews left Europe and went to live in North Africa. The Palestine that was wiped off the map when Britain granted you somebody else's country had Jews living side by side with Christians and Muslims for century upon century without the slightest trace of discrimination or violence or pogrom.
I'm a witness. I know the Arabs are very good, no problem till the Zionist movement starts. My grandmother tell me, before the Zionist movement starts, they babysitting each other, the kids. They bar off and watch each other like brothers, like brothers. The idea of Zionism to take away the land from the Palestinians, from the Arabs, is starting the whole fighting. Not Arabs the problem, not Jews the problem, not Judaism, not Muslim, only Zionism.
Rothschild Zionism. It was created by them, it is controlled by them to this minute, and it was created as a secret society within the web to massively contribute to the manipulation and control of our global society and individual countries, etc., etc. It's Rothschild Zionism.
In the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and until now, a lot of things have been attributed to Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam, which are untrue. One of which is magic. There are some of al-Yahud, the Jews, who attribute magic to Sayyidina Sulaiman. And the whole story of the temple also is attributed to Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam. For example, the Jews or the people of the book, they associate Sulaiman alayhi salam with someone called Asmodeus, A-S-M-O-D-E-U-S. And this Asmodeus was the chief of the devils. And they associate him with Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam, and they say that this devil, chief of the devils, was the one who assisted Sulaiman in building and constructing, and he is the one who used to tutor and teach Sulaiman magic, and to teach him many of the skills that they say Sulaiman had. And you would find that many cults and movements, they attach themselves to Sulaiman. Many of these secret orders, they claim that they go back to Sulaiman. And the most famous of them is the Masonic movement, Al-Masoniyya, the Freemasons. You would find that the concept of the Temple of Solomon, is something that is central, or it is very influential on the ideology of the Freemasons. Also, movements like the Kabbalah and some of these other mystical Jewish cults, they practice magic which they claim they have learned from Sulaiman, and it goes back, they claim that the lineage goes back to Sulaiman. Now there is some truth that there is magic that goes back in lineage to some very early Jews, but it does not go back to Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam. It all goes back to where? Where did the Jews learn this magic? That some of which still exists until now, and it's very powerful magic. We're not talking about tricks. where you hide a coin and you bring it out from somewhere, or you bring something out of the hat. We're not talking about those tricks which they fool the kids with. We're talking about some serious magic that could do some serious harm. Where was that learned from? We know that Fir'aun, in the time of Fir'aun, there was some magic, but Allahu A'lam, even though it was very powerful magic, but it was limited to the field of optical illusion. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَحَرُوا أَعْيُنَ النَّاسِ. They have committed magic to the eyes of people. But we're talking about some other magic that could influence the psychology and the spirit of people. Where was that learned? In Babylon. And how did they get it from Babylon? We know from the history that the kingdom of the Jews was destroyed by who? Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian kingdom, they defeated the Jews in the Holy Land and they broke up their kingdom. Not only that, they took them as slaves back to Iraq in Babylon. They took them back to Babylon. And the Jews were cut off from the true religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were cut off from the scripture for quite a while. And they were under the influence and the dictatorship and the oppression and the tyranny of the Babylonians. And that is where a lot of the distortion that happened to the religion of Judaism, that is where it occurred. It occurred in Babylon. Where was the Talmud written? And who wrote it? It was written by the 70 rabbis who were in Babylon. And now that is the central and the focus, that is the law and the central focus of the Yahud now. They have left the Torah and they are following the Talmud. And the Talmud was written by the rabbis who were influenced by the regime and the environment in Babylon. So if you read about this history, you find that Babylon is associated to it all. There's a lot of association with Babylon. A Talmud came out of there, and magic, and these secret orders, they came from Babylon, rather than from Sayyidina Sulaiman, even though they attributed to Sayyidina Sulaiman.
Adam expelled God from the garden. But the Zohar asks a very radical question. It says, who kicked whom out of the garden? And the Zohar actually teaches Adam expelled God from the garden. It's as if we're still in the garden.
בגלל זה אני אצלוב אותך. איך אתה מעז להטיף ליהודים התמימים? אלוהים! למה עזבתני? אתה נאצי ישו, אתה נאצי!
טופי! לא, טופי, אני מפחד! אני הלכתי על המים, אני הפכתי טופי, לא!
זה רק אפקט, פחדן!
לא! או, טוב! לא! לא!
Think about this clip next time some so-called Christian Zionist tells you to send your money to Israel. I don't blame some of you for thinking that you're supposed to support Israel and the powerful Jewish organizations in America. After all, the media constantly tells you that it's a Christian's duty to support Israel.
Naast Joodse organisaties en de politieke lobbygroep AIPAC scharen Wolt en Mearsheimer ook de miljoenen evangelische christenen onder de Israël-lobby. Allen hebben zich tot doel gesteld om de belangen van Israël te verdedigen en kritiek op Israël te doen verstommen.
There's a new day in America between Christians and Jews. We don't agree on everything, but we agree on this, that we are going to be together, inseparable in the defense of Israel and the Jewish people.
We have millions of people in the infrastructure. We have over 22,000 spiritual leaders, and some of those spiritual leaders have 1 million or 1.5 million names on their mailing list. We have the major radio, television ministries in America supporting what we're doing because every evangelical believes the Bible. And the Bible has a clear mandate to be supportive of the state of Israel.
There is no specific discrimination against Palestinian Christians as opposed to Palestinian Muslims. It's a shared suffering.
Christians see themselves very much a part of the Palestinian national movement. They identify with the Palestinian people as being their people.
Palestinian Christians have difficulty getting to churches on Sunday morning if they wanted to come to Jerusalem because they don't have that permission or that legal right, according to the Israeli government, to come to Jerusalem for worship.
This I picked up in a home of a wonderful Christian family in Beit Jala. And this is the kind of armor-piercing weaponry that's being used against civilians, innocent civilians.
But the Christians here have to live with exactly the same sorts of annoyances and frustrations of occupation as their Muslim neighbours. Bethlehem is just a 20-minute car ride from Jerusalem, if you have the right permits. If not, the separation wall, checkpoints and expanding Israeli settlements cut the town off from the city next door. Some fear Bethlehem will soon be a ghetto, surrounded on all sides.
We've been living under occupation since many years, many decades actually. Since 1948 the number of Christians has decreased from 12% to 2%, making only 60,000 in West Bank, Gaza and Jerusalem.
The irony is that it's much easier for a tourist from France to visit Bethlehem than it is for some Christians living in the Palestinian territories.
To the backyard. And I asked the Lord, why is that? And this is what I felt the Lord say. For the first time in their life,
the Palestinians are the ones who have been scattered to the four winds, to the four corners of the earth. The lucky ones living here as refugees in Vancouver. The unlucky in their millions living in rancid, rat-infested refugee camps in the Arab countries alongside Palestine. Generation after generation, some of them now there for 62 years. Others for 43 years. Some of them can even see their own houses from their refugee camps. Can you believe it? The Jenin refugee camp, 1 square kilometer, 14,000 families. They all come from Haifa, a shining city on the sea. If they stand on the roof of their shack with a pair of binoculars, they can actually see their own houses, their own gardens being lived in and enjoyed by foreigners who came from Vancouver, where they already had a house, where they already had a life, where no one was persecuting them, where no one was taking any action against them. And they went there and stole the houses of the people who've lived for the last 60 years.
Of the 500 Palestinian villages in what became Israel in 1948, 400 were destroyed.
These efforts to destroy the possibility of their returning home were countered by the United Nations, which continues to affirm their human right enshrined in international law and morality to return.
A Palestinian who had lost her land or lost his land as the result of the creation of Israel in 1948 cannot come back even for a visit. I can go back to Israel as if I were returning and claim immediate citizenship, having no historic tie, speaking no Hebrew, knowing no one in the country, having no family who ever was there. All that one needs is being Jewish, a religious group like any other.
The panel of jurors who considered cases presented to them about the treatment of Palestinians brought together renowned lawyers and judges. They found that the discriminatory policies in place do constitute apartheid and urged all nations to impose sanctions against Israel until it changes its legal systems.
In the Israeli legal system, preferential status is afforded to Jews over non-Jews through its laws on citizenship and Jewish nationality, the latter of which has created a group privileged in most spheres of public life, including residency rights, land ownership, urban planning, access to services, and social, economic and cultural rights.
The jurors, who hailed from Britain, Spain, France, Northern Ireland, the USA and South Africa, plan to raise the findings in their political and legal spheres in an effort to ensure equality for the Palestinian people.
In terms of racism, there is no difference between apartheid South Africa and Zionist Israel. The Zionists, however, have the biggest weapon that was not available to South Africa apartheid. Bigger than F-16s, tanks, and nuclear missiles put together. It's called the Holocaust. The Holocaust allows Zionists to manipulate world public opinion and to stifle any possible open discussion. It is simply their biggest asset. Today, to be an anti-Zionist is construed as being anti-Semitic, and to be anti-Semitic can send you to prison in Europe.
The reason they use the names Israel, the Star of David, hijacking, stealing the identity of Judaism and the Jewish people is in order to get a legitimacy for their existence, that people should say, oh, it's God given to them, and that they should put fear and intimidate people from speaking up against their actions because they'll call them anti-Semitic.
Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money, and the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong, and they are strong in this country. As you know, they have power, which it's okay. They are talented people, and they have power, money, and media, and other things. And their attitude is Israel, my country, right or wrong, the identification. And they are not ready to hear criticism. And it's very easy to blame people who criticize certain acts of the Israeli government as anti-Semitics, and to bring up the Holocaust and the suffering of the Jewish people, and that justify everything we do to the Palestinians.
It's used politically in a very effective way, in a very cynical way. I mean, it's very hard to say this, but I think it's true. It's seen as a very useful PR tool. You know, the way the government plays on the guilt in Europe over the Holocaust, so that you can't criticize us. Look what you did to us, you see. It intimidates non-Jews. It closes up discussion. It's very effective. And Israel is willing, for the sake of its PR and to silence critics, it's willing to sell the victims of the Holocaust.
The sad fact is that those 6 million Jews that died because of a fascist, racist ideology are cynically being used today to justify and support another fascist, racist ideology. As most of my family, on both sides, were amongst the victims of the Holocaust, I withdraw my permission from Israeli government and Zionists worldwide to use their death in such a hideous way.
Go ahead.
Hi. During your speech, you made a lot of references to Jewish people as well as certain people in your audience, not Jewish people in general, but certain people, especially in your audience, to Nazis. Now, that is extremely offensive when certain people are German. And they're also extremely offensive to people who've actually suffered under Nazi rule.
I don't respect that anymore. I really don't. I don't like and I don't respect the crocodile tears the crocodile tears. No. I'm sorry, folks. Allow me to finish and allow me to finish. Listen, sir. Allow me to finish. Allow me to finish. Sir, I don't like to play before an audience the Holocaust card. But since now I feel compelled to. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother, please shut up. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. Every single member of my family on my father's side,
the Jews did not take arms against the Germans.
My late father was in Auschwitz concentration camp. My late mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. Every single member of my family on both sides was exterminated. Both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's precisely and exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me and my two siblings that I will not be silent when Israel commits its crimes against the Palestinians. And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering and their martyrdom to try to justify the torture, the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians. So I refuse any longer to be intimidated or browbeaten by the tears. If you had any heart in you, you would be crying for the Palestinians, not for what's been done.
Israel has established all of these checkpoints within the West Bank, which require Palestinians to wait hours and hours to go very short distances.
Just the freedom of movement, it's something that Palestinians are denied on a daily basis. The access to Jerusalem, the access to health care, the access to hospitals, clinics, and schools.
We're talking about 3 million people who's had the freedom of movement totally stopped.
It's a violation of international law, that the right to freedom of movement is a fundamental right in the Declaration of Human Rights.
I think it's hard to understand what occupation is. I think it's a foreign concept for many Americans, what it's like to live under military occupation.
The definition of an occupation is when a foreign army occupies your land physically and controls your life.
In addition, Palestinians under occupation, and this is why there's so much struggle against the occupation, they're not citizens, they don't have rights, they don't have civil rights. They're under a military rule.
Gaza, the most crowded piece of land on earth, is little more, ironically, than a concentration camp.
سجل ما عاصين لأنهم يلدين ما عاصين استقلوه عمري ما حقول تيرورستين نحن تيرورستين نحن يلدين مختنين تيرورستين ها.
And the world looks on.
They have tickets for Israel, but Belgian police won't let them check in. They're part of the so-called Flytilla, a coordinated attempt to show solidarity with Palestinians in the occupied territories.
Apparently, Israel is a closed country. I didn't know. They told me my name is on a list, and I don't know if I'm on a list of terrorists, of people not welcome in Israel. I asked for an explanation, but no one can provide one.
It's the third year European activists have tried to highlight Israel's tight control of access to the occupied territories. The organisers hoped 1,500 people would fly into Israel's main airport on Sunday and then declare their intention to travel through Israeli checkpoints to Bethlehem to open a new school. But in Paris, it was the same story. Israeli government pressure on European airlines was proving persuasive.
On me refuse l'embarquement. Pourquoi?
They have refused to let me board. Why? Because the government of Israel has given its orders. I find this absolutely intolerable. This woman has lists. Apparently I am on it. This means I have no access to Palestine. How long is this to go on?
لدينا أدوية فقط عندكم أم وعندكم أب كل واحد لكم أم وأب وأخ وطفل لكم أم وأب وطفل لا أريد أن أتكلم بهذه نحن نريد أن نقلب من قلبي إلى قلبكم لديكم قلب إذ تريد أن تسمع قلبك وإذ لم تريد أن تسمع قلبك يتحدث معك نحن ليس لدينا أي شيء ولا ليس بيننا وبينكم شيئا فلماذا تقفون هكذا لماذا والله ستحاسبون فحاسبوا قبل أن تحاسبوا نحن لا نأتي على أي حد لا نأتي لأي حد ولكن نحن لن نتحرك من هنا نحن لا نستطيع أن نتحرك من هنا أتينا من آلاف الكيلومتر لدينا أمانة ليس لهم زيت لا يأكلون لا يشربون لا ينامون ببيوت ولكن بخيم ونحن نفعل هكذا ولا نرى ولكن نرى والقلب يرى والقلب يسمع والله لا نريد منكم أي شيئا والله لا نريد أن نقاتلكم ليس بيننا وبينكم شيئا لا نريد أن نقاتل أي حد لقد تقابلنا من ناس كثيرا من ديانات خلفية كثيرة
Israel sent its best trained military commando against a flotilla that was about to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza. On board, they had peace activists carrying books, paper, medicines, cement. It wasn't a police force. It wasn't people who were trained to deal with civilians. It was a unit that was trained to kill. And they killed. They killed 9. They didn't kill. They executed. And again, write Mavir Marmara execution, and you will see Israeli soldier executing peace activists on board. The Israeli obviously argue that they were terrorists, because the logic is very simple. Once you are hit by a Jewish bullet, you become a terrorist. That's the way it works.
The persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupying territories is under the occupation forces is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know.
This is the dictionary definition of genocide: the systematic and widespread extermination or attempted extermination of an entire national, racial, religious or ethnic group. Never can what is happening in Palestine and Gaza have been described so accurately. More and more people killed through war, killed through bombing attacks, killed through shootings, killed through lack of food and adequate medical care.
But it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to retain that land, and then to exclude the Palestinians from their own property and subjugate them so that they can't arouse and demonstrate their disapproval of being robbed of their own property. That's what's happening in the West Bank. And the people in this country, in America, never know about this. They never discuss this. There's no debate about it.
I was in a meeting with number 2 in the Israeli embassy in Norway at a workshop with the Norwegian Institute of Journalism. And he said that every child who died and every child who was killed was a tragedy. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Ambassador, we share a common moral ground in this aspect. But how can you explain that you have killed in Gaza more than 400 children in about 3 weeks? And he looked at me and he said, and this was in public, he said, who trained Dr. Gilbert? Who trained this doctor to know the difference between a child and a terrorist?
So the fact that they killed all these children, they're saying we can get away with it. It's impunity. It's just, nobody is going to stop us.
They're never punished.
1,400 people were killed in Gaza. Of those 1,400, up to 4/5 were civilians. About 6,000 homes were completely destroyed in Gaza. A chicken farm was destroyed. Israel went in with its tanks, ran over the chickens, killed about 50,000 chickens. Exactly one Israeli soldier had committed a crime in Gaza. He stole a credit card and rang up a bill on the credit card of $400. That was the only crime that your government could discover.
They have never been punished. Israel has broken more United Nations Security Council resolutions than all the countries in the world put together. They've broken more international law than all the countries in the world put together. Yet, and this is the unkindest cut of all, this is the insult that's added to injury. The Palestinians, who are the victims of terrorism, are called the terrorists, and Israel, who practice the terrorism, are called the victims of terrorism. This insult is unbearable so far as the Muslim world is concerned.
This is the face of Palestine. Well, tell me what you see. Combat boots. Yeah, another terrorist 5-year-old.
Ese es un ejemplo de doble moral. El gobierno de Obama condena el terrorismo, siempre y cuando no sea cometido por ellos mismos. Por ellos, Estados Unidos o sus aliados, Israel. Nos acusa a nosotros, a mí me acusan de patrocinar el terrorismo. Son ellos los que patrocinan el terrorismo.
Everything that Israel does in the occupied territories, U.S. taxpayers are paying for. The U.S. gives the financing, it gives the military support.
Israel receives as much foreign economic assistance as all the countries combined in the world.
They bombed a housing shelter in Gaza where they had told people to take shelter, They shelled this house some 24 hours, apparently, after telling them to take shelter. Let's just look at a little bit of detail on that allegation. Now, half of the 110 people ordered to stay in the shelter in the town of Zaytun were thought to be children. The United Nations has described the shelling of that house as one of the gravest incidents since the military operation in Gaza began. Well, overnight, as I say, at the United Nations in New York, the United States abstained from the vote on the ceasefire, but the 14 other countries voted in favor. And today, Israel's heavy bombardment of Gaza has continued.
Hamas militants and terrorists have fired more than 6,000 rockets, raining down on innocent Israeli civilians. Now, those are war crimes under the definitions of the Geneva Conventions.
Why would they listen to the fact that we're combating a terrible guerrilla organization which hijacks children and women, which uses people's homes as their launching pads for missiles? And this is the real question that faces the international community.
The Israeli army has been accused of using Palestinians as human shields during an operation in the West Bank.
This was Nablus last week. Israel's army came to arrest men they accuse of plotting attacks against Israel. We filmed as the soldiers moved through the old city, but now details are emerging of what else was going on. Look at the man in the black top in this rare footage filmed by a news agency. He's a Palestinian civilian. The soldiers push him ahead of them as they search homes.
They're standing in front of your Jeep. That's not a human shield? No. How is that not? You're using them to protect you from stones.
We ask them to speak to their friends to stop
And why are they standing right here? This is illegal, you know this.
Aprovecho para condenar de nuevo, desde el fondo de mi alma y de mis vísceras, al Estado de Israel. Maldito seas, Estado de Israel. Maldito seas, terroristas y asesinos. Y viva el pueblo palestino. Pueblo heroico, pueblo bueno.
إذا تشطرت بدي أصير إن شاء الله محامية عشان أصير أدافع عن الوطن عشان أحكم على اليهود.
بحلم أكون دكتور عشان أعالج المرضى اللي بيصابوا من اليهود.
It was a war, said Israel, to dismantle Hamas's infrastructure. It was not a war against the people of Gaza. This was a line repeated by Prime Minister Olmert when he announced a unilateral ceasefire. By then, nearly 1,400 Palestinians had been killed. But now a different picture is emerging. An Israeli newspaper has published accounts of soldiers involved in the operation. They say killing Palestinian civilians and destroying their homes was allowed in Israel's rules of engagement during the war.
All young Israelis, male and female, with few exceptions, are required to serve 2 to 3 years of active military duty in the Israeli Defense Forces. Sharon and Kayut served during the Second Intifada, a 4-year-long bloodbath that claimed the lives of over 3,000 Palestinians and 950 Israelis. After thorough introspection, these young men have chosen to speak out about their experiences as self-described brutal occupiers of a disputed land. And Sharon and Kayut are not alone. They are members of a new forum for young Israeli Defense Forces veterans called Breaking the Silence. Now a worldwide exhibition, Breaking the Silence features photo and art displays and live speeches.
In the first few months, most of the testimonies that we exposed were testimonies on the routine daily brutality and individual or group corruption that happens, humiliation, abuse, theft, looting, things that for Israelis mostly, but I think for any person that wants to deny, can say rotten apples, extreme cases, people that broke the law, broke regulations, and should be convicted or prosecuted. And it sometimes doesn't even matter that you tell them, well, these are stories about units, about hundreds or thousands of soldiers.
In the house they'd occupied, Israeli soldiers left some writing on the wall. Gaza, here we are, one read. You can run, but you can't hide. Make war, not peace. Arabs need to die.
And the last campaign that we did was a massive collection of testimonies on policies, procedures, orders, things that can't be very easily swept under the rug and called rotten apples because they are the system.
They're using white phosphorus. White phosphorus is a chemical weapon. For those of you who don't know, when it meets oxygen, and here's the funny thing about Earth, it's surrounded by oxygen, it produces a white smoke that then falls down on whoever's underneath it, that burns your skin. But it doesn't just stop at the skin. It keeps going on a lot of occasions until it hits bone. It causes second-degree and third-degree burns for sure. It is outlawed by the Geneva Conventions, but the clever folks in Israel and the United States, because we use it in Iraq, and Israel used it earlier in Lebanon, have come up with an exception. Oh, don't worry, we're not using it as a weapon. If we did, of course, that would be a war crime. Instead, we're using it as a smoke screen or illumination. Oh, you didn't have any other ways to light up the sky, and so you chose to use a poison gas instead. Yeah, I would go for a different way of going about that objective. That was the excuse we mainly used in Iraq. The Israelis are saying, no, it's just a smoke screen so our soldiers can come in. Well, your soldiers wouldn't want to come in because then their skin would be burned off.
Using gas, can you believe it? Using gas, white phosphorus gas. I've seen it in action. In 1982, when Israel invaded and occupied Lebanon, besieged Beirut, began to reduce it to rubble and ash, I visited the hospitals where the children were breathing white smoke from the white phosphorus that was burning within them. That's what it does. When you ingest it, you can't get rid of it. It cooks you, it bakes you to death.
They should enforce international law and call for an end to the occupation and take practical steps throughout Europe to compel Israel to abide by international law.
أول شيء إحنا كنا قاعدين في البيت بعد الاجتياح البري طبعا ليلة الأحد ليلة السبت طبعا بدأ الاجتياح عنا صار يخبطوا قذايف طبعا حوالين الدار طبعا صار رعب بين الأطفال عنا وخوف وإيش زي هيك يعيطوا مش عارفين إيش نعمل لهم بالضبط لا قادرين نشرد ولا نطلع من الدار ولا القذايف جنب الدار صار يخبطوا علينا. طبعا يوم الأحد العصر الجيش خبط علينا في الدار واحنا متواجدين كنا قاعدين في البيت يعني كانوا مقاومين وإيش زي هيك الأطفال قتلوهم تحت سن ال 12 كلهم قتلوا 5 شهداء ومن ضمنهم أبويا والد 6 شهداء. طبعا خبطوا علينا 3 قذايف فوسفور من النوع الحارق هذا. طبعا أنا كنت بعيد عن القذيفة حوالي 7 متر. كانت معي بنت الصغيرة عمرها 8 شهور. هوتها وجيت أخش الدار لو خبطوا القذيفة الثانية. طبعا إيش طيب طبعا خبطوا القذيفة الثانية. جيت أعد في الدار ما قدرتش أعد. صار الدخان أسود ما قدرتش أعد في النار بالمرة من ريحة الدخان اللي خبطوه هذا القذيفة الفوسفور. طبعا الشهداء طلعت زوجتي طبعا وبنتي لي فرح. ولا كانت عندنا حالات يعني مثلا إسعاف وشيء من هذا الطارئ. طبعا طيب حرقوها قدام عينينا حريق بالفوسفور. وزيد وحمزة وعبد الرحيم ووالدة أبويا. إيش ذنبهم هذول الأطفال يقتلوهم؟ هذا اللي ضرب اليدات ما عندوش دين. حتى خبط علينا القذيفة عارفين وين قاعدين في الدار. يم في نصنا خبط القذيفة وين كنا متواجدين. يعني عامد متعمد. ما يعرف ايش الواحد يقول حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. ليش تسامح؟ هذا فيش معاه وين السامح معاه؟ المسامحة على شيء يقتل الأولاد الصغار هذول بقاوموا وهم يقتلهم هذول الأولاد الأطفال الصغار. ليش نسامح فيه؟ حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل فيه. أهم شيء تكون سعيدة هيك كان بدي إياها. طبعا هذا مدللة كثير البنت بحبها كثير.
I mean, the subject of the topic, the topic today is treatment of children. And I mean, some of us are not very good at statistics, but it's worth thinking about a few things that are very, very revealing indeed about this, the cynicism, the brutality, and the callousness of the Israelis. I mean, one thing that was shocking was that the day after the Israelis deployed from Gaza, redeployed to the borders from where they maintained the siege, they started immediately, the last settler left, to have sonic booms throughout the night, which clearly was designed to disturb everybody, including the children. And it was very, very traumatic indeed.
You know, in addition to bodily harm to the ears, they shatter windows and literally just completely blow off doors from their hinges. And they're eerie because they happen usually in the middle of the night and still, and you don't hear what's happening. And all of a sudden, because it's faster, it's supersonic, so it's faster than the speed of sound, you just hear this immense sound, and it's as if a blanket of air literally just knocks you down, and then you hear the plane flying. And you know, after intense pressure was causing severe trauma and miscarriages, and it went to the Israeli High Court, and they said we can't rule on this because it's a security matter, which is the usual response. But you know, it eventually ceased, I think, under that pressure.
So what was unthinkable for Jewish children when there were still some in Gaza became something that they inflicted upon Palestinian children. And it was really a case of a few hours after there were only Palestinian children in Gaza that this torture was implemented.
لما بتسمعها ايش بصير معك؟ او ايش تسوي؟ ايش تعمل؟
اروح على الدار على السريع.
روح على البيت. ليش طب البيت اخترت البيت انت ليش؟
عشان مكان إيهام آمن.
أنا أحمد بن ناصر.
أنا آية. أنا بطل بايثون.
أنا مصطفى.
أنا جهاد.
يباشلي باخذ الطبقة رديت طوي الصالون أني أويز التلفزيون تبايت أبشلي بنا بايتشلي نرعاكمو أخذ شلي رأيت تراكتور ميوزلي تراكتور قدول فما خاطر رأيت أبشلي بخير.
In the past 4 years, Israel has demolished in the occupied territories more than 4,100 houses.
يعني قدول أنا وصلي يتسخن كدري مورالي ومنو غفاش الخيوط
4,100 houses. 17,000 children were left without a home. This isn't security, it's cruelty.
We finally reached Najla's district. They destroyed the house. The army says there were smugglers' tunnels hidden under people's homes. So they did this.
يا أروى شو هذا؟ أنت كنت فين؟
كنت في البيت كنا نايمين كليتنا وصار تجريف وطلع اليهود وصاروا يفجروا وبعدين هذا وصاروا يفجروا والقزاز كله طاح علينا والبيبان. اليهود ضلهم يزعقوا يقول اللي خايف على نفسه يطلع. ضلهم يزعقوا هذا فجروا الدبة بعدين راحوا ضلهم يزعقوا احنا خفنا نطلع كنا بدنا نطلع بالراية خفنا نطلع بعدين صار الدب قوي طفت الشمعة وصرنا نصوت كنا مسكنا ببعضنا.
Palestinian resistance to the occupation has been both non-violent and violent. Some of the violent resistance has been aimed at Israeli soldiers and civilians in the occupied territories, and some has been spilling over into Israel proper in the form of suicide bombers.
Scene of chaos and destruction, rescue workers rushing to search for the living among the carnage. The centre had been packed. It was just before the Jewish Sabbath. Now shoppers lay dead on the street, victims of a suicide bomber. This woman came looking for her loved ones, not knowing if they were alive or dead. There was no mercy here today, no thought about the baby inside this pushchair, but the infant did survive the slaughter.
This was a devastating attack on innocent civilians, and Israelis have reason to fear more days like this. Islamic extremists say they have other suicide bombers who are ready and waiting to do just what this one did.
I was very close to the pizzeria bombing in Jerusalem in August of last year, and I got there, faster than the police did. And I saw an Israeli baby without a head, a woman with a chair leg sticking out of her chest. My reporting, for example, I'm pretty brutal about suicide bombers. I call them wicked. And I say that, I use the word. But I also make a point of saying, why?
When you have a population that is being occupied, when their fundamental human rights are being systematically denied, when they're not allowed to move from city to city or from place to place without huge amount of harassment, when they're being subject to torture, when people are essentially in desperate conditions, it's not a surprise that they're going to be very, very, very angry.
They feel so helpless in the face of a powerful Israeli army that some Palestinians think the only answer, and I condemn this, but some Palestinians think the only response to a powerful army is a guerrilla tactic, going into Israel and setting bombs off in cities. And there's increasing support for this among Palestinians because of the growing frustration of not getting anywhere.
Nowadays, I would say there are possibilities for Israel to live at peace with what was or what remains of the indigenous population. But unfortunately, Israel is unwilling to resolve the conflict along the lines of international law, which would allow for some sort of coexistence between Israel and the population that was displaced and dispossessed.
ردا على الظلم والاحتلال وجرائمه المتصاعدة واستمرارا لخيار المقاومة قررت أن أنفذ عملية استشهادية. لم يبقى لنا خيار آخر للنضال. إسرائيل تعتبر الشراكة والمساواة مع الفلسطينيين في دولة ديمقراطية واحدة انتحارا لدولة اليهود، وهي غير راضية بتسوية الدولتين لشعبين مع أنها تسوية غير عادلة للفلسطينيين. تريد منا أن نرضى بالاحتلال كحل دائم أو نختفي عن الوجود. لم نترك طريقة إلا واتبعناها من أجل إجلاء الاحتلال، سواء كانت سلمية أو سياسية. مع ذلك استمر الاحتلال ومستمر في بناء المستوطنات ومصادرة الأراضي والمياه وتهويد القدس والتطهير العرقي. تفوقهم العسكري وقوتهم السياسية والاقتصادية موجهة ضدنا لإرغامنا على قبول معادلتهم، إما أن نقبل بالدونية والمشروع الصهيوني وإما أن نقتل. وكوني شهيدا لا أخشى الموت، ألغي بذلك تهديدهم وأتفوق على جبروتهم السياسي والعسكري.
People who were trapped into a corner and feeling so desperate that there was nothing else they can do. Now you think about a woman that's 18 years old and beautiful, who has lost her children, lost her father, lost her brothers, lost her mind, and she thinks that the only thing that she can do to send a signal back to the people who are the criminals of this is to do an act of reprisal, is to strap on her 60 pounds of explosives and walk out onto a bus or a cafe or a hospital or wherever where there are other innocent people and blow herself up as an example. That's frustration. But is it justified? Islamically, it is not. But can it be understood in the context of perpetuated, protracted oppression that brought about a sense of madness? Yes.
Any violence by a large population is not because this people is more violent than any other. It's an alarm, it's a sign, it's a signal that something is wrong in the treatment of this population.
Where is the outcry? Where is the voice of the day? Where is the voice of the people?
Exploitation and social degradation, all of them from the same enemy.
It is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against the government whose plan is only savage attack on an unarmed defenseless people.
This year will be a year of violence. This year comes the keynote is violence and the slogan is attack.
This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine! Long live Gaza! Long live Palestine! Long live Gaza! Long live Palestine! Long live Gaza! This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think there's little boys throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on little girls while they sleep in their bed. And don't get offended by facts, just try and listen. There is nothing more anti-Semitic than Zionism. So please don't bring bad vibes. So please don't bring bad vibes when you speak to me, because there's plenty of rabbis that agree with me. It's your choice what you do with this message. Don't get confused. I view this from a human perspective. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? Israel is a terror state, terrorists I terrorize, I testify on television, televised and telling lies. This is not a war, it's like systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. Wish I could take your tears and replace them with laughter. Long live Palestine! Long live Gaza! Long live Palestine! Long live Gaza! Long live Palestine!
القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا قدس تنادي قدس تنادي قدس تنادينا يا بيت القدس لنا أمل ستعود القدس لأمتنا ونطهر ساحتك العذراء وننشر فوقك رايتنا ننشر فوقك رايتنا القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا بيت القدس لنا أمل ستعود القدس لأمتنا ونطهر ساحتك العذراء وننشر فوقك رايتنا ننشر فوقك رايتنا القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا أبناء فلسطين صبرا فالله ينفس كربتنا ستعود لنا قدس دارا وتعود لنا قدس وطنا أبناء فلسطين صبرا فالله ينفس كربتنا ستعود لنا قدس دارا وتعود لنا قدس وطنا ما جاء الليل بحلكته إلا والفجر وتى بسلام.
زمان قبل الثورة كنا بنتمنى وبنقول مش مهم ان احنا نشوف التمكين ولا مهم ان احنا نشوف تحرير بيت المقدس، لكن مهم ان احنا نحط لبنة في هذا الطريق. اولادنا او اولاد ولادنا او اولاد ولادنا هيحرروا بيت المقدس. بعد الثورة المصرية بقول لا، احنا ان شاء الله اللي هنحرر بيت المقدس، احنا ان شاء الله اللي هنصلي في بيت المقدس، احنا ان شاء الله اللي هننال الشهادة على اعتاب المقدس، على اعتاب بيت المقدس. مش هننتظر ولادنا ولا اولاد ولادنا ولا اولاد ولادنا. الوقت اعجل واحنا اللي هنحرر بيت المقدس ان شاء الله.
القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا القدس تنادينا قدس تنادي قدس تنادي قدس تنادينا